Welcome to Rising Up for Justice, a special weekly series presented by Rising Up with Sonali, an independently produced subscriber-supported program syndicated to radio stations, free speech TV, and podcast platforms. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer. Our nation and our world is overrun by billionaires and bigots, but they are few and we are many. On this series, exclusive to subscribers of Rising Up with Sonali and viewers of Free Speech TV, we'll hear from organizers in the movements for social justice and dig into the nuts and bolts of values, strategies, tactics, narratives, and building power. This week, my guest is Chip Gibbons, Policy Director of Defending Rights Dissent. This is an organization that's a national civil liberties group defending the American people's right to know and freedom to act through grassroots mobilization, public education, policy expertise, and advocacy journalism. Welcome to the program, Chip.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on.
So I gave a brief summary of what Defending Rights Dissent does, but give us more background in terms of the kind of work that you're engaged in that gets more specific. What are the issues that are important to you, and what is the main goal of the organization?
Well, I think the issue that's probably the most important to us is the right of the people to engage in political expression. Our organization has existed for 6 decades. It's actually the product over time of the merger of a number of smaller organizations. I will not bore people with an organization chart of this group merging to this group, but I will go back 6 decades ago briefly to note that we were founded as the National Committee Against the House Un-American Activities Committee to take on the McCarthy-era repression at a time when many people were afraid of speaking out because those who did had their livelihoods destroyed. They were smeared, they were targeted. In the process of taking on McCarthyism, we angered another gentleman by the name of J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover's FBI subjected us to ruthless surveillance. This came out in the mid-70s, and with the demise of HUAC, we became very interested in defending political expression from government surveillance, both the FBI at the federal level and what they used to call red squads, the police intelligence squads at the local level. A lot of the reforms on police red squads, the FBI, even the abolition of HUAC, were part of a post-Watergate, post-Vietnam attempt to rein in the intelligence community. And this included not just restrictions on surveillance, but restrictions on presidential war making, restrictions on CIA covert action. So as part of the zeitgeist of the time, we sort of expanded at that time our mission from not just going after the FBI spying, but also going after CIA covert action. So throughout the 80s, we were opposing the funding of the Contras while also fighting the FBI surveillance of activists with the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. A lot of the post-Church Committee pre-9/11 attempts to roll back those reforms were predicated on, surprise, surprise, fighting terrorism. So throughout the 90s, a lot of our work was in response to a Clinton-era anti-terrorism bill, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which allowed the administration to ban groups as foreign terrorist organizations, criminalize material support for them, and really disturbingly to us, use secret evidence derived from the intelligence communities in deportations. This was largely used, you won't be surprised, against Palestinian solidarity activists. And obviously after 9/11, the second half of our organization, the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, formed to lead the grassroots movement against the Patriot Act. So as part of this defense of your right to speak freely, your right to act, if you will, we've always opposed surveillance. And, during the War on Terror years, we opposed Guantanamo. We're still opposing Guantanamo, which is tragically still open. We opposed the drone assassinations, which Trump has now expanded into the Caribbean and the war on drugs, as well as fighting for the right to speak freely. And in, the last decade, bringing us to the present, a lot of our work has been around defending the right to protest. We've seen a probably coordinated effort to put forward laws and restrictions on the right to protest, as well as just the sort of typical police brutality you see when people raise their voices for justice, as well as defending the rights of whistleblowers and journalists, people like Edward Snowden or Julian Assange, who were exposing the abuses of the national security state and were prosecuted under the Espionage Act. Uh, in the last 2 or 3 years, I think the biggest threat to political expression, the biggest threat to your freedom, to your right to know and freedom to act, has been the response to Israel's horrific genocide in Gaza, where we see the majority of Americans wanting a ceasefire and the majority of our government not wanting any sort of ceasefire. And the response of the government has been to follow Brecht's sarcastic advice from a poem a long time ago of, well, wouldn't it be easier to dissolve the people and elect another, and have really employed repression to break the movement for Palestinian solidarity. Under the Biden administration, we were looking at a situation that was the worst situation for civil liberties since the post 9/11 era. Trump has come into power with his hatred of dissent, his hatred of civil society, and he said, well, okay, let's take it back to the McCarthy era. Let's take it back to the Palmer raids. And we really have seen this escalating attack on dissent, attack on transparency in the Trump administration across the board. But a lot of it has been enabled through what activists have long called the Palestine exception to free speech. And it's no secret that Trump's early abuses of sort of politically motivated deportations have all been mostly targeting pro-Palestine organizers, people like Mahmoud Halil. And, that's not surprising because there's a long history of such deportations. We were fighting them in the 90s. And that the unwillingness to extend First Amendment protections to Palestinian solidarity activists, to people who are speaking out against war and genocide, has created the weapon that Trump can now use against civil society broadly. And we're talking about in the wake of the horrific assassination or killing of Charlie Kirk. And as a free speech organization, we don't condone shooting people for their views, even if their views are hateful or horrible. What we're now seeing that the Trump administration is talking about using RICO against activists and conflating speech with violence and all of these things that they have been doing already to the Palestinian solidarity movement because of that. So that's sort of where we are as a crisis point right now.
And so your work spans history and is more relevant than ever in this particular moment. And some of the things you're describing just seem to be that your organization is tailor-made to take them on. I'm wondering how because so much of what you're talking about is about kind of narrative work and what are the narratives that prevail in terms of the stories that the nation is kind of grappling with. Because for years we've had the right rail against cancel culture and say that they're for free speech. And of course, as soon as they have power, they have turned it around and begun a mass cancellation project of people who they disagree with. And how do you combat the weaponization of free speech?
Yeah, and as an organization that was founded to take on McCarthyism, let me tell you, cancel culture is not new to the right. In a lot of ways, they pioneered it. I mean, it is really troubling that you see these sort of cynical manipulations of freedom of speech from organizations and forces that have historically been at the forefront of crushing free speech movements. I do think that part of that has to be a principled defense of freedom of expression. I think that some folks on the left in the last 10 years, maybe longer, haven't been as strident about free expression as they should have been, and they've forgotten the importance of it. But I And I think that as a result, they've surrendered one of the best weapons they have, which is the weapon of the First Amendment, the shield of the First Amendment, shield of the First Amendment, or the ability to, say that we have a right to speak out. Now,
Now,
obviously,
I want to
they're
take a
not to
little issue
blame.
with that. Like, do you really feel that
Sure.
the left has given up on that? If anything, I feel like the left has actually had a principled stand on. I mean, okay, it's hard to say the left because we're talking about a very, very broad based what is the left, right? It's really people who I think broadly agree that democracy is important, human rights are important, and centering people's humanity is important. And those rights, of course, include free speech. And I'm hard pressed to wonder who on the left has said that free speech is not a thing that we should back.
Well, again, I want to clarify. I said a part, and I think it's a very small part, and it's a part that gets blown out of proportion by the right.
Exactly.
And I was going to conclude with, I mean, traditionally the loudest defender of freedom of speech has always been the left, going back to the abolitionist movement, where it was the slaveholders that wanted to ban abolitionist literature, going back to the um, uh, World War I with the Espionage Act, going back to Vietnam. I apologize if I misspoke. What I was just saying was, I think for us, being principled in freedom of speech and defending it is core to our ability to calling out the hypocrisy of the right. And I think there's a small number of people, very small, who didn't do that. And as a result, they're not in as strong a position. And I think one of the things that I've always done is to defend free speech as a left-wing principle. I wrote multiple pieces in Jacobin about the left's tradition of freedom of speech, about free speech as a left-wing value, to make the point that you're making right now, to push back on these false narratives from the right that the people who want to spy on Black Lives Matter protesters and expel students for supporting Palestine are free speech warriors, and the people who have fought against the Espionage Act and for the right to protest. And, pretty much every free speech right we have in this country comes from the social movements fighting back against repression. And I wasn't trying to say the left is responsible. It's not. The right is responsible here. But it was just to sort of point back that I think core to our taking on that hypocritical narrative has been to explain how free speech is a left-wing value. And I apologize if I misspoke and I sounded like I was going off into like Glenn Beck, oh, the left doesn't support free speech, and that's
Well,
why we're
and
going
I
to
think
fire them
I
territory.
raised that for that very reason, that we often, unfortunately, do hear those on the right who claim that they're the defenders of free speech make false claims about the
Yes.
left being anti-free speech when it really has been the quite the opposite for the most part, especially given the history that you were just saying about of your organization taking on HUAC, etc. So let's talk about what it is that what is the mechanism by which defending rights and dissent achieves its goals. I imagine litigation is central to the work that you do, but also public, narrative building and public relations campaigns.
So we don't do litigation. So and litigation is very important, but it's not central to
I
our
see.
work. It's central to we defend the right to know and freedom to act through grassroots mobilization. So getting people to speak out, getting them to tell their members of Congress or whoever else, these aren't our values. We want you to uphold free speech through public education, explaining to the public the various ways in which the First Amendment has been torn apart, or also just making complex bureaucracies of repression transparent. I think the Trump administration in the last couple of months has heavily weaponized immigration law in order to attack the First Amendment. And you have these very confusing immigration proceedings where you'll have a judge in immigration court, which, isn't really even a real court. It's someone who works for the Department of Justice, Brooks Bondi, say one thing, then a federal judge will say another thing. And for a lot of activists, it's like, well, what's going on? And we can explain and walk through that process. We also use policy expertise. We're very well versed not just in the constitutional legal principles here, but also the history of how they've been applied. So, I've written memos for members of Congress explaining how the Espionage Act or how immigration law has been used historically to attack First Amendment rights, you know, Eugene Debs and Los Angeles 8 and whatever's happening now, as well as going through the nuts and bolts of the various laws and court cases that explain how they can do this, right? So the Supreme Court, so you have an interpretation of immigration law that limits court's ability to hear cases about selective prosecutions. Well, how does that impact Mahmoud Halil's case? You have a ruling from the Bureau of Immigration Appeals that says, well, if the Secretary of State signs a magic piece of paper that the person poses a threat to U.S. foreign policy, you have to grant the removal proceeding, no matter what evidence is presented, and explain how those laws and rulings have historically been used to enable repression by the right, mostly on the left, as well, and what they are. So I think that's a huge part. Then advocacy journalism. I've spent a lot of time in the courtroom reporting on various legal proceedings, whether it's a drone whistleblower or with Julian Assange. I went to London for his extradition many times, or these immigration proceedings against Palestinian supporting students who the Trump administration is targeting with deportation, and reporting on what's happening in those hearings. The other big part of our advocacy journalism, and it's a growing part, is the use of the Freedom of Information Act to engage in investigative journalism. FOIA investigations are becoming probably one of our main tools in exposing what's going on and pushing back. Through FOIA, I was able to uncover FBI surveillance of pro-Palestinian groups, and right now we're looking at FOIA to see, is the Trump administration talking to right-wing groups like the Heritage Foundation or Batar? What are they saying? What types of policies are being put together to target pro-Palestinian students, to target pro-Palestinian activists, and obviously as the post-Charlie Kirk repression grows, we'll look at that targeting as well, and to try to get those documents. FOIA is very difficult because the government, you'll be shocked to learn this, is not very transparent. It's gotten worse under Trump.
Right.
But we do, through crowdsourcing and support from donors, through lawyers who help us, litigate a select number of cases. I said we didn't do litigation. What I meant by that is I'm not in court suing people, but we do have FOIA lawyers who, when we're able to crowdsource and get donations from our supporters, we can bring lawsuits. And right now we're gearing up for a lawsuit against the Trump's DHS, Trump's State Department, Trump's DOJ, and that includes the FBI, to try to get their communications with these right-wing McCarthyite groups, as well as to try to get the policy guidance that they've put together that we know is being used to target pro-Palestinian students, and if possible, get the case files that have been from the investigations, either through Homeland Security investigations, that's the DHS's, ICE's investigative unit, or the FBI, into these students and groups. And that's going to be a big fight, but we were able to raise from our supporters the money to bring this lawsuit, and I'm very excited that we're going to be able to do so. And every day we hear about some new right-wing group that's meeting with Trump. We heard that the Heritage Foundation traveled to Israel to meet with Mike Huckabee to talk about criminalizing U.S. support for Palestine.
And just to interrupt there, how would you explain to somebody who thinks, well, so what? What if the Heritage Foundation traveled to Israel with Trump? Why is that a problem? How would you respond to that?
Well, sure. The problem is that these right-wing groups have historically been able to direct what Trump calls the deep state, in terms of who they repress and who they go after. We've seen this again and again where we'll get FBI files back and some very far right group will be cited in the reason for opening the investigation. Probably some of the listeners might not remember David Horowitz's front page magazine, but some might.
I
That was
do.
his. I know you do. I do too. But I got FBI files back where in the opening of the investigation, they cited to an article in David Horowitz's front page magazine. People who don't know, David Horowitz's front page magazine was arguing there was this grand conspiracy between Islamists and the radical left, and that anyone who opposed the Iraq War was really working for this, secret Islamo-communist, whatever, global
He was like
conspiracy.
Charlie Kirk before the age of Charlie Kirk. I mean, in many ways, we've had the sort of lists of academic watch, the academic watch lists. We've had versions of that before, yeah.
He did The Professors. That was his
Exactly.
book, The Professors, the people who are ruining America. And before, Charlie Kirk, there was this guy called John Rees, who was a real crank. And I've had FBI documents where the FBI in the 90s under Bill Clinton got a memo from this John Rees outfit that was very much like David Horowitz or Charlie Kirk, and they go through and underline names of people listed and go and investigate them. So we've seen David Horowitz used to predicate an investigation into nonviolent activists. We've seen the Information Digest people, this sort of 70s and 80s group that was, McCarthyist, go through and, send these bonkers memos that like World Bank protesters are continuing the Cold War to overthrow liberal democracy, and they go and they underline this name and that name and that name, and then the next thing you know, they're at the Albuquerque Community College looking for the Feminist Liberation Organization because this right-wing person said they're in a plot to overthrow democracy. Turns out they weren't. You'll be shocked to know this. So these sorts of meetings shape what the deep state does.
Right.
And they shape it in a right-wing direction.
Right. And we know, for example, since you brought up the Heritage Foundation, that they had a how-to guide for the president's first year that they published last year called Project 2025. And we're seeing example after example of the guidance being enacted by the Trump administration. I'm wondering if you can put your organization, Defending Rights and Dissent, into the broader context of social justice movements and the political progressive landscape. Who are your natural allies? How does your organization's work fit in with this, defense of our rights? You mentioned Code Pink, I imagine, as one such group, but put it into context.
Yeah, Defending Rights and Dissent is in a very interesting position because we are a free expression organization. So we work very strongly with other free expression organizations. Since the Espionage Act work, we've worked very closely with all of the big press freedom organizations, as well as independent journalists. But also in defending the rights of activists, we work alongside many of the activist communities who are under attack. So, if Code Pink is being attacked by Trump, we're not going to say, oh, keep your distance from us, Code Pink. I can't. Medea Benjamin's a good friend of mine, so I would fail at keeping my distance from them. And Olivia too. But, stay over there. We're going to give these broad ivory tower defenses of First Amendment. No, we would work with Code Pink to defend their rights if there's an attack that's coming, and there may be. So we work alongside many of the groups that we defend. We also are very concerned with the Trump administrations and the Biden administrations and every administration's abuse of constitutional war powers. I mentioned opposing CIA covert action or drone strikes were a big part of our work, and we now see a horrific slate of extrajudicial killings in the Caribbean. So we do work with a lot of anti-war groups as well. So we work with the free expression groups, we work with the press freedom groups, we work with the anti-war groups. We also work with the activists who are under attack.
Well, then finally, Chip, what do you want from individuals, progressive-minded folks? How can people support the work the Defending Rights and Dissent does? And as you're answering that, give out a website as well where people can can support it. I imagine that, it takes money to sustain these things. It takes resources. So give people a way to support you.
Yeah, our website is rightsanddissent.org. And as I mentioned, it does, we do, for our litigation on FOIA, we have crowdfunded it. We've gone to our supporters and say, hey, we think we should know what the McCarthyite groups Trump is talking to you. And if you support that kind of work, please, of course, donate to us. We also produce resources like the Gaza First Amendment Alert that are being used not just by activists, but I can tell you members of Congress, people at the UN. If you think there should be those types of resources for people making decisions that are written by people who will defend progressive movements, who understand the legal structures that are undermining them, as well as how this fits in the historical context, please support us, because this is not lucrative work. I can tell you that much. We need every support. And obviously, I know times are very, very tough right now, and that, many working people don't have money to give even to good causes. So just coming to our website and reading about the FOIA documents that we've uncovered, contacting your member of Congress, there are action alerts. Those are equally as important. I mean, we value every contribution in time as much as we value every contribution in money. I mean, we can't do this alone. We are a movement. And, if you give even a handful of dollars, that goes really far at a small organization like ours. And if you can't, but you can contact your member of Congress, you can promote these investigative work that we're doing on Twitter, or share it with individuals, or send it to your member of Congress even. That's as much, if not even more, appreciated.
And rightsanddissent.org again is the website. We'll post a link to that from our website. Chip, thank you so much for joining us today. Good luck to you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
My guest has been Chip Gibbons, Policy Director of Defending Rights and Dissent, a national civil liberties organization that defends the American people's right to know and freedom to act through grassroots mobilization, public education, policy expertise, and advocacy journalism. This is Rising Up for Justice. And I'm Sonali Kohatkar, host and executive producer of a new weekly half-hour series exclusive to viewers of Free Speech TV and subscribers of my long-standing program, Rising Up with Sonali. Find out more at risingupwithsonali.com.